Hi, welcome to Premium Builds, I'm John. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the case I chose for my most recent personal build, which is the Fractal Design Torrent Compact. Overall, it's a really good case, but there are some heavy compromises that you need to make if you are planning on using it. So I thought I'd take you through them, and then you can consider whether it's the right choice for you and the kind of PC you want to build, or whether you might be better off looking at another option. I've been a bit of a fan of Fractal's cases for a while now. I had a Meshify C Mini which served me well for a couple of years. However, a requirement to use a capture card for this channel forced me to use an ATX motherboard, and that in turn forced me into a new case, which was the Meshify 2. I bought that near release and before they'd actually released the Meshify 2 Compact, and I was in somewhat of a hurry, so I didn't want to make the mistake of buying too small a case again. That case blew me away with its build quality, ease of cleaning filters, and some really nice touches like the removable top panel for access, and fantastic cable management options. It was really a fantastic experience to build in, and it's been a top tier case, even if that blank space at the front has annoyed me a bit. However, when the time came to rebuild around an older Lake CPU, Fractal announced the Torrent Compact, and on the face of it, it seemed like the ideal choice for me. It fitted an ATX motherboard, it wasn't overly large, and I've long since been a fan, of the ethos of fitting a few very large fans to a case and running them as slow as possible. It's the recipe for a quiet, cool running PC. So that brings us on to the USP of the Torrent Compact. Those two vast 180mm fans in the front, dominating the front of the PC. They are almost comically big and boast a huge 145 cubic feet per minute of airflow each. Some quick math suggests that at full speed these two fans could clear the entire air volume of the case 3 times a second. If that's not airflow, I don't know what is. However, of course, you don't want to run fans at full speed ever if avoidable. So by setting these fans to run very slow, they still provide more than adequate airflow through the case whilst providing minimum noise. And in fact, the PC is running next to me now and you can't hear it, I hope. Equally, it means that I can run my PC in the same room as I film while I film without it introducing unwanted noise into the recording. These fans retail at about $35 each, so $70 of the total value of this case, and to be fair, the rest of the case does feel like a $100 case. Whilst it's perfectly well built, it doesn't feel exceptional in the same way the Meshify 2 does. The metal feels a little bit tinnier, and the plastic, whilst it looks okay, is just plastic and does feel quite tinny to the touch. Things like the top of the case and the front grille section do actually feel a little bit cheaper to the touch than you might be expecting from the look of them. It doesn't feel quite as well thought out as the Meshify 2. The feet have to be removed to remove the bottom filter, for example, and that requires unscrewing them. Meanwhile, the entire front section has to be pulled off to access and clean the filter, whereas the Meshify 2 had a really nice little front panel that opened and you could take the filter out that way. So overall it feels acceptably well made, but it is honestly on a par with something like the Corsair 4000D, that kind of $100 case price range, rather than a case that feels like it's really from a tier above in terms of build quality. Then we come on to planning your build in this case. The Torrent Compact is actually really very prescriptive in what you can fit where. You can fit a front AIO, but that requires removing those two large fans and fitting baffles in their place to fit a 360 or 280mm radiator. If that's your aim, there are far better cases that act as a starting point for that. Any configuration you're considering that means that you take away those 280mm fans basically means you're better off looking at other options. You can mount an AIO in the bottom of the case, but be aware you need a specific design with the pump in the radiator. Otherwise your cold plate pump fills with air and doesn't cool the CPU properly. MSI's recent AIOs have this, and Fractal have recently released a new Lumen AIO lineup which also has this design, no doubt to address this issue and allow the bottom mounting of an AIO in this case. The other issue with that mounting is that it heavily restricts your options for fitting PCIe cards into the lower slot of the motherboard. No viable AIO would fit with my current capture card in this lower slot, for example. You can free up some space with an M-ATX board, but M-ATX high-end boards are a slowly dying breed, so that makes it a less attractive compromise if you are going for a nicely balanced PC. The options for a custom liquid loop in this case run into a lot of the same problems as an AIO does. There's very limited space to fit a pump, there's very little additional space for the wiring and tubing that needs to go into a build like that, and there's also limited availability of radiators that would really make sense. I'd love to see a 360mm thin radiator in the front of this case with those 180mm fans blowing through it, but the manufacturer of those I can find only a couple and none of them have stock at the moment of 360 as in 2x180mm radiators that would go sensibly into the front of this case. So whilst it's not your only option, certainly the best option in this case is a high-end air cooler, and that's what I chose to put in here with the Noctua NHD15S. This takes advantage of the huge airflow on offer whilst presenting minimal compromise to the components you can fit. In making this case narrower, they've also managed to make it impossible to fit a 140mm fan in the rear exhaust position, which is something I really liked about the Meshify 2. That's a real oversight because it is just a couple of millimetres extra clearance there. A simple bit of redesign would have allowed one of those fans to fit. I think that's a real shame in a case that's all about fitting large fans wherever possible because they do run quieter. If you do need an exhaust in this PC, it would have to be 120mm, and that means you would probably hear it over the 180mm fans. For the time being, I've omitted an exhaust fan and I'm just using those two front fans to drive air right through the case and out of the back through positive pressure. Now we come on to the major problem with this case, which is that truncated PSU shroud combined with a very narrow area behind the motherboard tray in order to do cable management. That combination of decisions has made cable management in this PC a real chore. Fractal made the area behind the motherboard tray significantly narrower, just 20mm clearance. Because the PSU shroud is truncated, that limits the normal tuckaway space for excess cables, so there's significant cabling to fit behind the motherboard tray, including the thick braided RGB and fan cables. There's only just depth for an extension cable connector, as you can see in my build. This issue is heavily compounded by Fractal's decision to put a glass panel on the back of this case. Not only does it rob a few precious millimetres from the space you can tuck cables away in because it's thicker than an equivalent steel panel, but it's completely inflexible. That means you have to make sure all of the cables fit completely flat within the confines of the case. If your cables aren't completely flat or you can't crush them into position, then your side panel simply won't fit on. At one point I'd actually routed just the cables that came with the case itself into the positions I wanted them to make maximum space for the additional cables I was going to put in, and at that point I tried to test fit the rear panel of the case and couldn't fit it on. I had to remanage the cables just that came with the case even to fit the back panel back onto it. This leads to unpleasant situations like squashing cables against the backside of the motherboard, something I always hate doing due to the risk of shorting stuff out on spiky motherboard electronics. It means that cable management when building in this case is an unpleasant but highly necessary task. Nonetheless, with some perseverance, I was able to make this PC, which is pretty fully stacked. I've got two 2.5-inch SSDs, a 3.5-inch drive on the top, and cable extensions in there. Had I run into problems, the cable extensions would have been the first thing to go, and unless you're confident, I honestly wouldn't advise using them. Hopefully some companies will come out with some good custom cables for this case and a few popular PSUs, because that would really resolve most of these issues, but it would of course add to the cost of getting a build into this PC. However, I think fundamentally from Fractal's perspective, this case would have been far better off with a metal back panel. You can't make the cables neat anyway, so there's no point in having them on show, and the metal panel would have both given you some more space but also some more flexibility just with allowing it to bulge slightly in some areas where you've got a lot of cables in order to fit it and keep those cables tucked away. Overall then, I do really like this case. It's silent in general use and quiet whilst gaming, and it keeps temperatures well down. It has space for everything that I need to put into it. However, there are some compromises that you should consider and plan for if you do want to build in this case. First up, it is inflexible. If your ideas diverge from a PC with a single GPU, a large air cooler on the CPU, and just one 3.5-inch hard drive maximum, then it's time to look elsewhere. Cable management is a real pain, and you should consider a power supply with custom cables or perhaps even making your own if you want the PC to look nice on both sides. You will also need to spend a good deal of time getting all those cables tucked away neatly. However, you do only build in it once and cable management is a one-time job, so long as it is possible, which I've shown that it is forgivable provided you're willing to put the time in. However, for my needs and for the build I planned, I think it is pretty much ideal. It's exactly what I wanted. I really like the way it looks, I love the way that it's nice and quiet, and I do actually like the way that I'm no longer reliant on a liquid cooler. I do prefer an air cooler just for the quietness, the ease of setup, and the fact that it performs perfectly well with the i7-12700K I've got in this system. I know that the Noctua is a really good option with that, and this case caters to it really well. If this case doesn't meet your needs perfectly, then I'd certainly look around at things like the full-size Torrent if you just want a little bit more space, or perhaps the Meshify 2 if you want a really huge case that can stack a huge number of hard drives in the front of it. Or of course there's the Meshify 2 Compact, which is a really professional looking, really well made case with a bit more flexibility in terms of water cooling options, and it's also that bit more pleasant to build in just because of the better cable management options on offer there. I really hope you found this overview useful. Maybe it's given you some food for thought if you were looking at this case. As I say, I'm really happy with it, but it's not a case for everyone, and you should probably do your research before you commit to buying and building in a case like this. Please do check out premiumbuilds.com. We've got loads of advice and reviews, loads of things to help you get the absolute most out of your next PC.